barriers to choose Canada for their next tourism destination. So let me start a little bit with the current situation. And again, I won't spend too much time on this because this is our daily bad news, and this is what we're dealing with in each one of our businesses. The first one is just give us a sense of the significant challenge that we face. As Ingrid pointed out, I've been at Destination Canada and I've been through tourism. I was there in tourism at 9/11. I was there in tourism during the SARS epidemic. I was there during tourism during the global economic crisis in 2009. And we can see the impact that those events have had on tourism with those declines in tourism. And many of you will be with me knowing that we as an industry were freaking out during those periods, nervous, looking and seeking for government intervention, government support, stimulus funds, and stimulus money. But just look at today. Look at where we are today. Look at the impact that COVID has had on our global industry itself. And it just sort of makes the global financial crisis, SARS, and prior to that, 9/11, just seem like a drop in the bucket compared to the challenges that we're facing today. And we know that many of our operators, many of our hoteliers, and many others who are on this call today are barely staying alive. We also know that the predictions about scenarios and recovery have exceeded our expectations and are going, in fact, poorer and poorer recoveries than we had expected. We anticipated three different scenarios at the global basis, and we are getting worse than the worst case scenario that we put together for the potential and for the idea of recovery. Told you I'd have some bad news for you. We also know that this impact in Canada has been rather devastating. We know that tourism itself and the associations dedicated to the business of tourism, including aviation, hospitality, restaurants, the hotel industry, of course, have banded together and created the coalition of hardest hit businesses. And in fact, that coalition, that collective impact has been rather significant. We heard some really good news a few days ago out of the Government of Canada with their interim budget that helped support it, the idea that we were still in trouble. And there's an acute awareness with all levels of government and those that certainly in Ottawa, including the opposition parties, that truly understand the impact that tourism is having. Is it enough? We'll still, I think I heard earlier that the devil will be in the details as we see how easily and effectively this rolls out. And of course, what we need and what tourism and hospitality needs more than anything is a free open of those borders. And again, this is where politics and vaccine will come into play. We know that the impact of tourism has had on Canada. These are Canada's top source markets. We know that they're down somewhere between 97-98% in total visitation from those markets. And again, as Canada had just achieved in 2019 a record year for tourism, the impact on our tourism industry and the source markets from which the bulk of our international tourists come have also been devastated. So what's government doing? Of course, in addition to the newly mentioned measures, we know the government's working hard to address the health impact of COVID-19. I don't know why I have two 19s. I guess they're working doubly hard, but working very hard in terms of addressing the health impact. They're also working hard to address the challenges facing the tourism industry. We know that they're acutely aware of the challenges in those programs. They have business relief programs. We've got government incentive and funds to support Destination Canada, who's further investing in provincial tourism organizations, investing in local destinations, support for small and medium-sized businesses, investments in marketing programs that will drive local tourism, developing the idea or potentially developing the idea of travel bubbles. Of course, those bubbles have most recently burst as we're entering into an acute second phase of that COVID. And they're testing. I like to say the word testing twice. Testing at Calgary, Toronto, and Montreal airports for those travelers who are either entering through those airports into Canada or leaving from Canada. But we'll talk a little bit later about how some of these measures are great, and some of them simply aren't going fast enough, and some of them aren't as effective as they might be in other countries. So while the Government of Canada is working hard, the hospitality and tourism businesses in Canada are just frankly working harder. They're working harder to address the health impact of COVID-19. There it is, 1919 again. to address these challenges and the existential and very real threat to business failure. And I have to applaud, and we have to give so much credit to your collective businesses out there, whether they're hotels, whether they're restaurants or tourism experiences, because they're working very hard at keeping employees working. They're keeping their businesses operational. They're over delivering against the guidelines, rules, and protocols. If the government gives them a rule or a protocol, they make sure it's doubled down and making sure that they become police in their own restaurants and their own events and their own places in order to make sure that those protocols and those rules are being followed. But they're also living constantly with changes to those protocols, changes and updates to the guidelines and those rules. Again, working very, very hard to make sure that those are really being covered. So one day, investing and spending money that they don't have in order to support a new guideline, just to see that guideline change a week later, and having to reinvest money again that they don't have in order to support that. I believe that the tourism and hospitality industry should be lauded for supporting the government and their priorities of keeping us safe at almost every turn. And they're even supporting government again when the hospitality industry and the tourism industry has been shamed due to outbreaks at their establishments. And again, it's just a reminder that business establishments aren't contagious with COVID. It's really people that are, and the businesses really need not be shamed. But also, most of those businesses really are clinging to liquidity and business continuity, and I think we need to be highly aware of that. So what tools do we have other countries are using to support tourism? We know that other countries are doing, in some cases, a faster, better, or a different job in responding to the challenges that they themselves are impacted with. It's been about 5 months since COVID testings happened at airports in Iceland and in Costa Rica, and after the recommendations from the World Travel and Tourism Organization to support COVID testing at airports. We are just now starting to test the testing at airports, and I believe that those things need to be accelerated. Proof of COVID-19 free test within 72 hours of arrival has happened. Hawaii is starting to look at this, but other destinations themselves have looked at it ourselves. And if you look at Canada, when we're looking to leave Canada to go to a destination that requires this proof, there's about a 6-week waiting list to get a test of COVID-free test upon departure. So challenges in ourselves getting tested. The CDC is now recommending a 7-day quarantine for those who have tested negative upon arrival, and a 10-day quarantine for those who have not taken a test yet, versus 14. And those are more reflective of the science itself that says that most cases will reveal themselves within 5 days. And for most of those 5 days, within 10 days, they'll be revealed. We're really looking at that 10 to 14 day as a very, very minute number of cases of the potential for COVID, someone to be infected with COVID, to actually show the symptoms of COVID between 10 and 14 days. So our 14-day quarantine period, when we ask people to come into Canada, is really rather excessive, and even the CDC in the United States is now reconsidering their 14-day requirement. All of these measures themselves would help us improve the demand curve for visitation into Canada. We know that in many other countries, they've eliminated ambiguous country, state, or provincial barriers to travel, some that are inconsistent and some that don't make sense, and really focused on bubbles where there are safe areas where they can bring people in. Just talking to Brisbane Tourism yesterday, and there's a very real possibility, of course, that Australia and New Zealand will create a safe travel bubble in order to expand the opportunities for their tourism industry. And the government and health authority messaging is using messaging platforms. They need to use messaging platforms like they do in other countries to really unscare visitors. They've done a very, very good job of scaring us into submission, but we need to start to consider messaging into 2021 that says we no longer need to be scared. We can come out of our basements and we can travel again. Need to encourage a safe return to travel and enthusiastic residential support for travelers, and encourage the welcome of visitors to communities, cities, and resorts, as they're doing in many other tourism-dependent destinations around the world. So while other governments are using this pause to rethink tourism itself, working on projects in Sri Lanka, and South Africa. Both of them are looking at completely revamping how they approach tourism. Both of those destinations have admitted that tourism has happened by accident and not by design in those countries. They've been subjected to very, very low yield, high volume visitation, and both of those countries themselves are looking to sort of set the repause button and to rebuild a vision for tourism for their destinations that focuses on a higher yield, perhaps a lower volume, higher yield destination. Also destinations, of course, that distribute their visitors a lot more equitably than they're actually doing today. So both of them are using this pause itself to rethink and reinvent what tourism means for their countries. For Portugal, I've just read today that they're taking thousands of Airbnbs and repurposing those Airbnbs that are no longer in demand, of course, repurposing them into public housing and renting them off the Airbnb owners at a lower rate, but a more confirmed and a reliable, perhaps, revenue source for the coming years. So some really clever use of some Airbnb repurposed into a different kind of use. And New Zealand, of course, perhaps you've heard this quite famously, their new and very blunt Minister of Tourism talked about a focus on only the one percenters that he was going to recast and reposition his destination to support. And he had some very disparaging words for those visitors who weren't within that 1%. And if you want to a quick laugh for today, you can Google that one. So our thoughts here, and my idea is that the greatest barrier to the return of tourism itself is not COVID-19, but really it's the fear of travel itself. The idea is that we know that tourism itself has had a very, very bad rap. It's only 8 months ago that we were glued to our news programs watching as cruise ship passengers were stuck in COVID-infested ships themselves as Canadian travelers are being airlifted back to Canada and straight into quarantine. Tourism itself has borne the brunt of this disease worldwide. Anyone carrying a suitcase was believed by most of the world that they must also be surely carrying the disease, and we've been very, very nervous about anybody carrying a suitcase. In fact, I think tourism is in dire need of a PR plan. And we also know that borders will actually need to reopen, but for tourism to recover, what kind of policy will be required for those borders to reopen? Have we been thinking about what those preconditions are going to be required by government in order to open those borders? And that will really depend, in my view, on the confidence Canadians place on tourism, both to travel themselves and to welcome visitors to our provinces and our cities and our resorts. Because I think the greatest barrier to return of tourism, again, is the loss of confidence. So I'll talk a little bit about each one of these sections about the loss of confidence in tourism. The first one was the left-hand side, and this comes from Destination Canada's research. How travelers describe themselves in normal circumstances. They were adventurous, they were relaxed, they were booking travel and considering travel for themselves and their family. And now on the right-hand side, it's really how travelers view themselves now when they're considering and thinking about travel. They're worried, they're nervous, they're uncertain, they're reluctant to travel. And again, I'll show you some data that supports that Canada and Canadians are the scaredest travelers of 15 countries surveyed. More afraid than the Japanese, more afraid than the Americans, more afraid than the Australians. We are the scaredest nation to travel of the 15 countries that they surveyed. So here's that survey I was referring to. And the fear of travel for the world, the whole world, when they looked at about 15 countries that Deloitte surveyed, and they survey these, by the way, every month to determine what trends that might be happening. And in fact, we're getting and going only in the wrong direction. Only 27% of the 15 countries surveyed feel safe flying. Only 36% of them feel safe in a hotel, and only 27% are actually planning travel in the next 3 months. And when it comes to Canada, as I said, while that 37% feel safe flying, only 19% of Canadians feel safe flying. Only 31% feel safe in a hotel, and only 17% are planning travel in the next 3 months. And I can assure you, as I said earlier, of all the 15 countries that they evaluated, Canada is the lowest in terms of confidence in total travel. And this is just simply not good news for our return to travel. But I think I said this earlier, I do promise you some good news at the end, and where Canada might have some competitive opportunity and advantage. We also know that insurance itself is creating a lot of ambiguity in terms of our ability to consider getting on airplanes and to consider travel. And we come out, and I know that Aeroplan and Air Canada have come up with different schemes to support out-of-country medical insurance in the event that COVID is caught. But there are also articles that say that that's just simply not enough. And again, taking a worst case scenario and looking at the potential cost if you were to acquire COVID in another country, what the impact that actually might be on the bills and all of those things, and knowing that that coverage wouldn't be enough, and again, creating a loss of confidence in the potential for travel. We also know, and I think many of you follow Destination Canada and their evaluation of the level of welcome towards visitors. Canada has fewer than half of British Columbians are open to people even visiting them from other communities that are near them. Less than 1 in 4 British Columbians is open to people from other parts of Canada to come and visit British Columbia itself. So there's this nervousness. And again, British Columbia, while it's among one of the lowest groups across Canada, the lowest being in the Atlantic Canada and the Maritimes, it has an impact on our ability to welcome visitors. We've all seen the news articles this summer about scratching cars with license plates from Alberta or other parts of or the United States and places like that. So there's an acute awareness that, again, if people carrying suitcases are also carrying COVID at the same time. There's also very significant confusion over the rules. And again, most recently, when the British Columbia health authorities and Dr. Bonnie Henry suggested that there was a travel ban, the Vancouver airport went crazy because people were not getting on the flights that they were scheduled to get on. So there's a huge amount of confusion around what a travel ban looks like, and confusion from our local authorities, including our provincial authorities, our health authorities, and even our municipal and city-based authorities. You saw this summer there's an encouragement to travel, but maybe don't travel. Travel, but just be aware if you travel. Travel, but, and as some of the literature said, know your risks. Bring your own groceries, but buy local. BC is open to visitors, but we're not encouraging you to visit. And what it constitutes essential travel only is actually unclear. And all of this ambiguity, and if somebody were to go and look at all of these rules and regulations, and they'd just say, it's just easier to stay home. Hearing stories about people being turned away at the ferries because they're not essential travel, and into other communities and roadblocks into communities. It's just been simply a challenge, and again, causing challenges with those rules. And one of the more key ones, and one of the more interesting ones, was from a Focusrite study that just came out recently. And the Focusrite study said the number one reason why, for most countries, almost every country listed here with the exception of Italy, the number one reason is that travel is just simply not interesting. Why would I go to another country to wear a mask, stand in a lineup, socially isolate myself, go through, get on that plane and take that risk, get into that hotel room and take that risk? Just simply not interested. Less so worried about the loss of joy of travel than about actually collecting the disease itself. So it's an interesting perspective from that research from Focusrite. So confidence is a challenge. Our confidence that we have for tourism is a challenge. The idea of whether or why people might want to consider travel is a challenge, and that might be expected. We might have to come to expect this. We are, after all, in the middle of peak COVID. It's happening to us right now. More and more cases are happening. We're turning on the news and getting only worse and worse news when it happens. So we might expect that these numbers would happen. But with those vaccines, maybe, just maybe, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And we keep getting asked, and I keep getting asked what my predictions are and whether we will see light at the end of the tunnel. And the answer that I've been giving is we're not really sure. Vaccines will have an impact, and they will hope for some potential return to tourism next year. But I always think it's a bigger question is the thing about tunnels is you come out a different place from where you went in. And I think that's probably the theme of the next part of the presentation is really talking about the changes that are required in order for us to welcome back tourism, to instill more confidence in visitors, to help us recover tourism going forward. So if tourism is looking itself to 2019 to guide our 2021 strategy, I believe we're looking in the wrong direction. We really are going to have to take that leap of faith and to try to see around corners and see what's coming up is as we look forward into 2021 and consider the impact that it will have on tourism. We know there are going to be ongoing challenges. We know that there's going to be low traveler confidence, and that will continue into next year. We know that tourism supply, its hotels, its experiences, its restaurants, they're in precarious positions right now, and some of them may not be around to help us with our recovery in 2021. Some of the channels that we've come to support on our travel trade channels, our airline partner channels, our cruise ship channels, our local transportation channels. Some of those will not come back with the same level of robustness that they came in before. And we know that with only 27% today, global travel is actually considering getting on an airplane and traveling itself. We know that fewer than 30% of consumers will even consider travel in 2021. And ultimately, what that will mean is that many, many destinations like Canada, like British Columbia, like Vancouver and Victoria, and other places will just simply be chasing too few customers because most of our customer base have taken them out of tourism. So what can we do to help inspire that recovery? The first is I'm suggesting that we need to work together to compel Canadians to travel within Canada. We know that domestic travelers will be the key to kickstarting tourism recovery while waiting for international travelers to return. We need to do this through marketing campaigns, through communications programs. We need to band together as the hardest hit industries to inspire confidence back again into our domestic travelers. We need to reduce interprovincial borders that are impeding our ability to travel from A to B to go to other places. And we need some authority to start to market again so that we can communicate to Albertans to come to British Columbia because in many cases they're coming anyways and give them the confidence to come and see our province here in British Columbia. We need to inspire Canadian confidence back to travel itself. Canadian confidence to travel and welcome visitors will hold a great deal of influence over government policy. We know that government policy has been really truly reflective of the values that Canadians have placed on their health and support for their health. And we know that early on in the pandemic, almost every government across Canada was rewarded with record high approval ratings. And in fact, those approval ratings buoyed some governments to go to the polls and get majority governments when prior to that they did not have those. And those are both New Brunswick as well as British Columbia have supported that. And we know that we've rewarded those governments as a result of that. Governments will make changes if they believe that Canadians can accept and support the changes that they need to make. Canadians' confidence in vaccines needs to improve. We need acceptance either for vaccines or for negative COVID tests on arrival will be critical for their and government acceptance for opening up international borders. How will governments respond to somebody who has achieved or received a COVID vaccine certificate to say that they have been vaccinated against COVID? I'm doubtful right now that the government has a plan right now, and people are getting COVID injections beginning next week and the following week from the UK and the US. Are we still impeding those people from their ability to travel into Canada? We also know that with negative testing at airports, we're testing that testing. The results of those tests, the preliminary results are very, very strong to support the idea that people are not actually entering our country riddled with COVID themselves. But when and where will the government be when we start to welcome back those visitors? And what are the preconditions and the conditions for their ability to open up our borders again? So 2021, I said, will be the year of the vaccine. Again, effective vaccine approvals in the US, UK, Canada, the EU, Japan itself will be among the very first countries that are going to start vaccinating their citizens on a much broader scale. But we also know that there will be a very unequal distribution of those vaccines. So if you're looking at returning source markets, and provided that the government supports opening up borders to those who have had vaccines, or hopefully to those who have proven with a negative COVID test, we have to look at some of those countries that are more likely to have vaccinated their residents. That will be, thankfully, the US. That will be the UK. That will be Japan and some of our other source key markets for Canada. Again, some countries will already noted and already stated that they require vaccines in order to authorize travel. One of those countries is Australia. Qantas Airlines just came up with a statement that said nobody traveling internationally with Qantas will be allowed on the plane unless they have a certificate of vaccination itself. Now that's Qantas' view. That's not necessarily Australia's view, but Qantas is the predominant carrier into Australia. So what that means so far is that they've severely in 2021 reduced the number of potential visitors that can actually come into Australia. Will Canada require evidence of vaccinations and reduce significantly the amount of potential travelers when they do open up their borders? Or will negative COVID tests on arrival be enough? Or will they follow CDC guidelines and reduce the time for quarantine? All three of those things will be important to determining our recovery for tourism next year. So 3 tools that we can use to address confidence. The first one is policy and messaging from governments and health authorities to reduce the ambiguity of messages and use more evidence in their decision making, again, and manage through risk. Again, when 98.4 or some number close to that is the percentage of those who will exhibit symptoms of COVID within 11 days, why are we waiting for 14 full days? And I know some cases they're asymptomatic. Those who may be entering are asymptomatic, but again, we have testing on arrival. We should need to speed that up. We also need to help Canadians feel safe to travel again, and I'll talk a bit about that, and then reposition our tourism and hospitality brands to reflect the values that our prospective customers have, and I'll show you some evidence to support that as well. First one is speeding up testing on arrival at airports. Canada's doing a good job of testing our testing. We're very fastidious about that. We always are, and we always will be about our testing. We want to make sure we're doubly and triply sure. But while we're doing that, businesses are failing on a daily basis. We need to make sure that we speed up those tests, that we're comfortable with the risk that comes with those tests. We need to eliminate our interprovincial travel barriers, or at least support testing on arrival and reduce the quarantine time in those barriers itself. So giving a wide swath for unrestricted travel across Canada will open up and create significant confidence in travel again across our country. We need government messaging to unscare consumers about travel when the usual precautions are taken. We need to stop business shaming unless they're not following the rules themselves. We need to learn to live with the virus and accept some level of risk. Again, zero COVID is not likely even in a post-vaccine era, and we need to understand what it means to live with that risk in order to restart our tourism and hospitality economies. And use more evidence basis for decisions. We're always talking about evidence, but again, some governments and health authorities themselves aren't using the level of evidence that are required alongside with levels of risk in order to make their decisions. Just a point about airline flights, and just a great example. Even Dr. Tam said that COVID-19 transmission on flights is extremely rare. As far as I know, up to last week, there had been no known cases of COVID transmission on an airplane. There's something about the ventilation systems on airplanes. And again, when usual precautions are taken, which include masks and hand washing and all those other things that we're taught to do that are critically important, there have been no transmission of cases. This is backed up by a Harvard study that supports exactly the same outcomes. Having said that, we can all open the Vancouver Sun on a weekly basis And there it is on page 3 or 4, the listing of flights that have had COVID on those flights, giving us all the impression that COVID is easily transmitted on flights and not transmitted at all. So we need this kind of messaging, and we need to communicate much more clearly that COVID is almost rare, if in fact almost never transmitted on an airplane itself. We also know that Destination Canada itself is developing an understanding that confidence in travel is important for the return of tourism to our country. And they've built a Rebuilding Traveler Confidence. Google it. You can find it on their website, but importance of how we need to collectively work together in order to keep visitors and travelers safe. We also know that a new study from Edelman Trust Barometer, they come up with a study that talks about the importance of brands and the faith that consumers put in brands in general, have suggested very dramatic shifts in what consumers value during peak COVID. The first one is that, again, this dramatic rise is that brands and products and services that put consumer safety first are up by a whopping 31 points. That is a significant rise in how important brands that put products and consumer safety first. Gives value for money plus 32. Again, there's some economic challenges that some people are facing, and again, looking for evidence that that value for money is important for them, and that brands that they will support in this COVID era up 26 points. The brands that care more about people than they care about profit. And now is exactly the time not for the hard sell. And again, you can see where Canada leads of these 8 countries. 61% of Canadians think that brands should put public safety first. Communicating public safety, and I know all of our restaurants and all of our hotels are already doing that, but you can see here, compared to many other countries, again, confirming the skittishness that Canadians hold for the importance of safety, importance of their health. And again, it just gives further credence to the loss of confidence that they have in things related in total to tourism. So where can Canadians emerge from this? What can we do? Let's recall that we began this discussion with a question of how Canada could more effectively compete for fewer travelers in 2021. And now we'll just shift very quickly into some potential good news and where Canada holds a potential competitive advantage to return to tourism in 2021, and a few trends to keep an eye on to see part of that seeing around corners, to see if we can't readjust or turn that valve a little bit in order to support growing tourism and return to tourism well, not profitability, but at least tourism customers in 2021. The first one is that Canada holds a much higher proportion of reliance on domestic tourism relative to many countries around the world who are much more reliant on international tourism markets. So they would be more eagerly awaiting for those borders to open up within their own countries. Second is that Canada has a very high value international brand. And a new study came out that just talked about the ranking of Canada's brand relative to other nation brands around the world. And then our ability to leverage post-COVID-19 trends in tourism. So the first one, as I said, the reliance on Canada on domestic tourism by country. In fact, Canada is within the top 10 countries with the most robust active domestic market relative to their international market. Now, when we were chasing international customers, 100 years ago or 2019, this would have been a deterrent because we really wanted to have much more international tourism dollars in Canada. But this year it's going to be a blessing into 2021 and 2022 as we have almost an 80% reliance, our tourism industry, on the domestic market. Again, why it's so important for us to recover that market quickly and create confidence in travelers. We know from tourism, our Destination Canada research, that domestic flight demand remains stronger than international demand. It's still below previous year's levels, but it is actually growing. There are some consideration and thoughts in terms of searches for domestic travel. So those are literally kicking the airplane tires here and considering and wondering what travel might look like and considering domestic trips themselves. So some good news in terms of the possibility of growth relative to what we saw back in the spring. Overall, domestic travel intent is back to nearly 2019 levels. Again, people kicking those airplane tires and those rubber tires to consider getting back into travel again, still with some trepidation. And again, it should be noted that this research was done just prior to the announcements of vaccines. So vaccines themselves will have, I suspect, a positive impact on searches and consideration for travel going forward. And things like ski and other winter activities, winter escapes, a little bit closer to home this year. But again, I know all of you and those who are engaged in the ski industry or in destinations that are adjacent to ski will know that there is a fairly robust interest in that kind of activity again this year. Second is our nation brand index. I talked about the value that the rest of the world places on the brand of Canada. And again, in total brand, sorry, I've got these numbers wrong, but Canada actually placed third. I should say 3 and not 5 under the Canada flag on the left-hand side there in the nation brand index. So Canada is number 3 in the world in terms of total brand. And why we were given such high ratings has really got much to do with what's important to people coming and considering a vacation in Canada. The first one is governance. We're viewed to be a very well-governed country. And again, during periods of COVID, that governance has been critically important. Again, in stark contrast to other nations like the one to the south of us, where governance is not perceived to be a very big strength right now. The second is people. And again, we're as destination as a country that puts people first, that strength, that number one strength in the rest of the world is going to be critically important going forward. We don't rank in the top 5 when it comes to tourism, but perhaps those rankings are going to be less important next year and the year after than these other critical rankings themselves. And when what's the Destination Analytics did a survey of those global citizens that they would feel most comfortable visiting in the next 5 years, Canada was ranked in the top 5 again, and the top 5 nations with the greatest net positive favorability for health crisis management, Canada was ranked number 2. And again, huge determinants of confidence in choosing countries to visit going forward. And again, I need not say in stark contrast to our biggest competitor, the US, where they're not faring at all, even in the top 20 on any of these lists right now. So a fairly significant opportunity again for Canada's future. And finally, some trends to watch. And again, these aren't going to be news to many of you, but again, this idea of localism, domestic tourism will grow, small communities and resorts, and wide open spaces. Those are evidence of continuing into the fall and winter season and into next spring. We saw evidence of that, of course, this summer in stark contrast to our cities. And so that those trends will continue to grow. The second one we're watching really carefully is digital nomads. And again, these are people who now, post-COVID, with that genie's out of the bottle, where people aren't necessarily going to be going back into their offices, or certainly don't need to be there from a Monday to Friday, who can work from wherever they happen to be, much like the way we're working today. These people will be able to pick up and go anywhere they feel like. They might want to choose to go to Big White and work there for the winter as a digital nomad, maybe another month, maybe a month or two there. Maybe they want to go to Portugal and work for a month from there. It doesn't really matter where they are. Their bosses don't care as long as they put in their time and get their work done themselves. So it opens up a whole new segment of potential travelers if we can encourage people to come to our country as digital nomads, as places who always wanted to experience maybe Canada's wide open spaces, outdoors or vibrant cities. We have an opportunity with that new segment. Again, we're doing some primary research on the characteristics of that segment to try to determine their profile, what makes them tick. Which ones would we go after? How long might they consider traveling? But again, these are people who may stay somewhere between three weeks and several months into a destination, not really calling them tourists and not really calling them residents. A focus on shoulder and winter season, again, as people are looking to travel outside of the busy months of summer, then more opportunities will be. And again, Canada is working on a project to encourage more travel and more tourism opportunities in the winter and shoulder season. And that's a project that's being run through the Government of Canada right now, doing many focus groups and workshops in communities to determine what it's going to take for us to get there. And finally, the idea, and sorry, two more to go. One, small team meetings will take place in real life for many of those digital nomads, those digital workers, people working from home. From time to time, they'll have to get together. And are they going to want to get together in the basement of what remains of their office? Or are they going to want to get together at a resort community? So this is going to look a little bit more like an incentive market where people might get together and find, I'll use Big White again as an example, but perhaps they're going to have team meetings where they can actually see each other IRL in real life, have their team meetings, and then enjoy some incentive style activities like skiing, like eating and dining out, and other team building exercises that they can do. And finally, again, developing marketing and communications. Again, the trend is really around travel with a purpose, the experience with a purpose, brands with a purpose, brands that care about people, brands that care about the safety of people. Again, will be back in vogue into 2021, regardless of when and how vaccines will happen. So that's it for in a nutshell. It's how we view the confidence of travel, how we view what Canada needs to do in order to recover more quickly, perhaps in other countries. Again, too many destinations chasing too few customers, even into 2021, even into post-vaccine 2021. How is it that we need to behave? What do we need to do? What kind of advocacy platforms do we require in order for us to achieve recovery and even gain competitive advantage for our country? Thanks very much.
Thanks, Greg. I volunteered on your behalf that if we have time, we'll open up for some questions. So I'm assuming you'll be fine with that.
Yes, of course.
So first, there was a couple of comments about getting the slide deck. The session is being recorded, and we will share that and the presentation deck that Greg has done so everybody can have access to that. The first question we had was that how can airlines overcome the public perception of them operating under confined spaces and that kind of, promoting or the lack of social distancing there?
You know what, it perplexes me. The answer to that is it's perplexing. We've got the Dr. Tam, Canada's national doctor for infectious control, says that airplanes are safe. We've got a Harvard study that says airplanes are safe. Each airline has that access to that study and has communicated that airlines are safe. We have governments from time to time communicating that, but we also have a media that loves to tell stories about COVID transmission on airplanes. And so I think we need to all collectively understand that. When I talk about evidence, this is what I'm talking about. I know that we all have I have friends, and we all have friends, and I send them that article because they're worried about getting on an airplane. And I send them the evidence that says there's been no evidence of COVID transmission on an airplane. And they still say, yeah, but I'm still not going to take the risk. And I'm perplexed because I don't know what risk they're referring to. So it's a tough one. But again, the more consistent we as the tourism industry can tell that story, the more likely it might be to stick.
Right. Thanks, Greg. And then somebody had mentioned about the resident fear in the various communities. And do you think that once the vaccine is here, that will eventually subside?
It really depends on the credence that people will place on the vaccine itself. Again, when we've got, in some cases, only 60% of people feel that the vaccine is safe or are taking a wait and see attitude. What kind of attitude will they have to the receptiveness of somebody with that vaccine? Are they going to be worried about maybe they're still carrying COVID, maybe that vaccine isn't effective, maybe it's not right? So I worry about the polarization of vaccines and the communication through the media next year. Again, the year of the vaccine, the polarization of vaccines, the anti-vaxxers, and all of those things will have an impact on the confidence. So again, as we can collectively, until we go blue in the face, collectively as an industry, talk about the safety of the vaccine, the predominance of that vaccine, and the vaccine itself is really the only way we're going to recover our industry. So we'll need some support on that.
And so there was a follow-up question to that how do you think can we, I mean, in the end, it is about education to the communities, about safe travel. Are there any top couple of recommendations that you have that people can use for distributing within the communities?
Yeah, I think, again, just going through the slide deck itself, and again, pulling out some of those, some of that evidence-based nuggets for it. I mean, it's not just my word, but it really is the backup from surveys and primary research out there. But talking with and through governments, working with TAIA BC, TAIAC, the hotel associations, all of those that are most impacted in that hardest hit industries themselves, and making sure that the communications platforms that we're all collectively using are really talking about confidence. Again, I really believe that that the government will do what Canadians support. And if Canadians support a return to travel because it's important to them, again, we're the nation that fears travel the most. We've got a long way to go. We need to start to chip away and chip away. It's not going to be one fell swoop, but chip away and chip away at that Canadians' confidence in tourism in order to return to the preconditions and the conditions that the government will require to return to normality.
All right. We've got probably 5 minutes, so we can maybe do one, if not two. I've got an interesting question here. Will the US being so low in desirability for tourism right now have a negative impact on Canada, knowing that a lot of people may potentially make plans to visit both the countries together?
Yeah, you're not wrong. About 30-something%, I remember this stat from about 5 or 6 years ago, visit to have a two-nation vacation kind of idea. And that might be a challenge. And it might be also a challenge that some of our air routes that we've come to rely on are not going to return, but have one hop through places like LA or San Francisco or Seattle or Chicago, New York. And that may have an impact on that potential. I think that there is a greater potential for an upside, however. We know that, again, in very stark contrast to how we've managed the virus, the politics of the virus, governance of Canada, and the brand that we have as a country will hold us in very, very good stead. And I think that rather than that consideration for, is it a vacation in Canada or the US this year, it will be very clear, I think, that a vacation in Canada, if we can compel and inspire them to choose our destination, again, if our borders are open, and if we choose those countries where we know vaccinations will be rolled out first, as our core source market. So again, lots of work will have to happen, but I think that we can prevail.
And I think we have time for one last question. A few people have asked about government and corporate travel. When do you think we see that coming back? Because almost all of us in the tourism and hospitality industry depend on that. And is there anything that we as an industry can proactively do to promote that?
Yeah, I think, you're all very acutely aware of the challenge. Most regions across Canada had a 50-person max limit on the number of corporate meetings that could be held, regardless of the size of the venue. And again, you had the Toronto Convention Center, which holds tens of thousands of people at any one time. In normal years, it was only really allowed to hold a conference of 50 people, which is kind of crazy. So they weren't really looking, again, at the evidence base and the support for that. So we need to first and foremost communicate that a same venue can have different groups of 50 in order to recover the meetings industry itself. But the corporate meetings industry is still pretty murky in my head. It's probably more experts than me that can answer those questions, like the meetings mean business people and those that are really dedicated to meetings and incentive travel, in terms of what their view is on how that might return.
Okay, all right. Walt, I think we are just about on the top of the hour, or Ingrid, I don't know who's leading this meeting. So the AGM the TAIA BC AGM is coming right up. And I see Walt's camera has come on, so I think that's a sign that, we're done with questions. So, Greg, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. The work that you've done with so many in our industry since the start of the pandemic has been valuable and beneficial from coast to coast to coast. I know we've all learned a tremendous amount today that we can contemplate as we prepare how best can we move forward in the months ahead. So thank you on behalf of everybody who's attended and our industry for everything that you do for us.
Yeah, you're very, very welcome. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate that. And good luck to everybody.